in which growing maturity rekindles the relationship between one pair of lovers, and self-absorption carries another pair to the brink of death. Chapter 9. It was past 5, and some of the guests had already arrived when the host arrived himself. He came in together with Sergei Ivanovitch, Koznishev, and Petsov, who had bumped into each other on the doorstep. These were the two main representatives of the Moscow intelligentsia, as Oblonsky called them. They were both people respected for their character and intelligence. They respected each other, but were in complete and hopeless disagreement on almost everything, not because they belonged to opposite tendencies, but precisely because they were from the same camp. Their enemies mixed them up, but within that camp each had his own shade, and since there is nothing less conducive to an agreement than a difference of thinking in half-abstract things, they not only never agreed in their opinions, but had long grown used to chuckling at each other's incorrigible errors without getting angry. They were going in the door, talking about the weather, when Stepan Arkadyevitch overtook them. Prince Alexander Dmitrovitch, Oblonsky's father-in-law, young Sherbatsky, Turovstin, Kitty, and Karenina were already sitting in the drawing-room. Stepan Arkadyevitch saw at once that without him things were going badly in the drawing-room. Darya Alexandrovna, in her smart gray silk dress, obviously preoccupied by the children's having to eat alone in the nursery, and by her husband's absence, had not managed to mix the whole company without him. They all sat like a parson's daughters, on a visit in the old prince's expression, obviously perplexed at how they had wound up there, squeezing out words so as not to be silent. The good-natured Turovstin obviously felt out of his element, and the thick-lipped smile with which he met Stepan Arkadyevitch said in all but words, "Well, brother, you've planted me among some clever ones. A drink at the Chateau de Fleur is more in my line." The old prince sat silently, glancing sidelong at Karenina with his shining little eyes, and Stepan Arkadyevitch could see that he had already thought up a little phrase to paste on this statesman, whom one was invited for, as if he were a poached sturgeon. Kitty was looking at the door, plucking up her courage so as not to blush when Konstantin Levin came in. Young Sherbatsky, who had not been introduced to Karenina, was trying to show that he did not embarrass him in the least. Karenina himself, by old Petersburg habit, coming to dinner with ladies, was wearing a tailcoat and white tie, and Stepan Arkadyevitch could see from his face that he had come only to keep his word, and was performing a painful duty by being present in his company. He was the main cause of the chill that had frozen all the guests before Stepan Arkadyevitch's arrival. On entering the drawing-room, Stepan Arkadyevitch excused himself by explaining that he had been delayed by that prince who was the perennial scapegoat each time he was late or absent, and in a moment he got everyone acquainted with everyone else, and, putting Alexey Alexandrovitch together with Sergei Koznishev, slipped the topic of the classification of Poland, which they both seized upon at once, along with Pesov. Patting Turovstin on the shoulder, he whispered something funny to him, and sat him down with his wife and the prince. Then he told Kitty how beautiful she was that evening, and introduced Sherbatsky to Karenina. In a moment he had kneaded the social dough so well that the drawing-room was in fine form and ringing with voices. Only Constantine Levine was missing. But that was for the better, because, going out to the dining-room, Stepan Arkadyevitch saw to his horror that the port and sherry had been bought at Deprez and not at Levitt's, and gave orders for the coachman to be sent to Levitt's as soon as possible. Then he turned to go back to the drawing-room. In the dining-room he met Constantine Levine. "I'm not late." "As if you could be anything else," Stepan Arkadyevitch said, taking him under the arm. "You have a lot of people? Who's here?" Levine asked, blushing, as he knocked the snow off his hat with his glove. "All our own. Kitty's here. Let's go. I'll introduce you to Karenina." Despite his liberalism, Stepan Arkadyevitch knew that acquaintance with Karenina could not but be flattering, and therefore treated his best friends to it. But just then Constantine Levine was unable to feel all the pleasures of this acquaintance. He had not seen Kitty since that evening, so memorable for him, on which he had met Vronsky, unless he were to count the moment when he had seen her on the high road. In the depths of his soul he had known that he would see her here tonight. But maintaining his inner freedom of thought, he tried to assure himself that he had not known it. Yet now, when he heard that she was there, he suddenly felt such joy, and at the same time such fear, that his breath was taken away, and he could not bring out what he wanted to say. "How is she? How? The way she was before, or the way she was in the carriage? And what if what Darya Alexandrovna said is true? Why shouldn't it be true?" he thought. "Ah, do please introduce me to Karenina," he barely muttered. And with a desperately determined step, he went into the drawing-room and saw her. She was neither the way she had been before, nor the way she had been in the carriage. She was quite different. She was frightened, timid, shamefaced, and all the more lovely because of it. She saw him the instant he came into the room. She had been waiting for him. She was joyful, and so embarrassed by her joy that there was a moment, as he went up to the hostess and glanced at her again, when it seemed to her, and to him, and to Dolly, who saw it all, that she would not be able to stand it and would start to cry. She blushed, paled, blushed again and froze, her lips quivering a little, waiting for him. He came up to her, bowed, and silently gave her his hand. Had it not been for the slight trembling of her lips, and the moisture that came to her eyes, giving them an added brilliance, her smile would have been almost calm as she said, "It's so long since we've seen each other," and with desperate resolution pressed his hand with her cold hand. "You haven't seen me, but I saw you," said Levine, radiant with a smile of happiness. "I saw you when you were driving to Yergoshevo from the station." "When?" she asked with surprise. "You were going to Yergoshevo," said Levin, feeling himself choking with the happiness that flooded his soul. And he thought to himself, how could I connect this touching being with the thought of anything not innocent? And yes, it seemed that what Darya Alexandrovna said is true. Stepan Arkadyevitch took him by the arm and brought him to Karenina. "Allow me to introduce you." He gave their names. "Very pleased to meet you again," Alexey Alexandrovitch said coldly, shaking Levin's hand. "You're acquainted?" Stepan Arkadyevitch asked in surprise. "We spent 3 hours together on the train," Levin said, smiling, "but came away intrigued as from a masked ball. Or at least I did." "Really? This way, please," Stepan Arkadyevitch said, pointing in the direction of the dining room. The men went to the dining room and approached the table of hors d'oeuvres, set with 6 kinds of vodka and as many kinds of cheese, with silver spreaders or without, with caviars, herring, various tinned delicacies, and platters of sliced French bread. The men stood by the fragrant vodkas and hors d'oeuvres, and the conversation between Koznishev, Karenina, and Pestov about the Russification of Poland began to die down in anticipation of dinner. Sergei Ivanovitch, who knew like no one else how to add some Attic salt to the end of a most abstract and serious discussion, and thereby change the mood of his interlocutors, did so now. Alexei Alexandrovitch maintained that the Russification of Poland could be accomplished only as a result of higher principles which ought to be introduced by the Russian administration. Pestsov insisted that one nation could assimilate another only if it had a denser population. Koznishev acknowledged the one and the other, but with limitations. To conclude the conversation, he said with a smile as they were leaving the drawing-room, "Therefore, there is only one way of Russifying the racial minorities, by breeding as many children as possible. There's where my brother and I are at our worst, and you married gentlemen, especially you, Stepan Arkadyevich, are quite patriotic. How many do you have?" He turned with a gentle smile to his host and held out his tiny glass to him. Everybody laughed, Stepan Arkadyevich with particular gaiety. "Yes, that's the best way," he said, chewing some cheese and pouring some special sort of vodka into the held-out glass. The conversation indeed ceased on that joke. "This cheese isn't bad. Would you care for some?" said the host. "So you've gone back to doing exercises?" He turned to Levin, feeling his muscle with his left hand. Levin smiled, flexed his arm, and under Stepan Arkadyevich's fingers a steely bump rose like a round cheese under the thin cloth of the frock coat. "What a biceps! Samson!" "I suppose it takes great strength to hunt bear," said Alexei Alexandrovitch, who had very foggy notions of hunting, spreading some cheese and tearing through the gossamer thin slice of bread. Levin smiled. "None at all. On the contrary, a child can kill a bear," he said with a slight bow, stepping aside before the ladies who, together with the hostess, were approaching the table of hors d'oeuvres. "And you killed a bear, I'm told," said Kitty, trying in vain to spear a disobedient slippery mushroom with her fork, and shaking the lace through which her arm showed white. "Do you really have bears there?" she added, half turning her lovely head towards him and smiling. It seemed there was nothing extraordinary in what she said, yet for him, what meaning, inexpressible in words, there was in every sound, in every movement of her lips, eyes, arms, as she said it. Here was a plea for forgiveness and trust in him, and a caress, a tender, timid caress, and a promise, and hope, and love for him, in which he could not but believe, and which choked him with happiness. "No, we went to Ver province. On my way back I met your beau-frère on the train, or your beau-frère's brother-in-law," he said with a smile. "It was a funny encounter." And he told gaily and amusingly how, after not sleeping all night, he had burst into Alexei Alexandrovich's compartment in his sheepskin jacket. The conductor, contrary to the proverb, judged me by my clothes and wanted to throw me out, but at that point I began talking in high-flown language, and "you too," he said, forgetting Karenin's name as he turned to him, "wanted to chase me out at first, judging by my jacket, but then stood up for me, for which I'm very grateful." "In general, passengers' rights in the choice of seats are rather vague," said Alexei Alexandrovitch, wiping the tips of his fingers with a handkerchief. "I could see you were uncertain about me," Levin said, smiling good-naturedly, "but I hastened to start an intelligent conversation so as to smooth over my sheepskin jacket." Sergei Ivanovitch, continuing his conversation with the hostess while listening with one ear to his brother, cast a sidelong glance at him. What's got into him tonight? Such a triumphant look, he thought. He did not know that Levin felt he had grown wings, Levine knew that she was listening to his words and liked listening to them, and that was the only thing that mattered to him. Not just in that room, but in all the world, there existed for him only he, who had acquired enormous significance, and she. He felt himself in a height that made his head spin, and somewhere below, far away, were all these kind, nice Karenins, Oblonskys, and the rest of the world. Quite inconspicuously, without looking at them, but just like that, as if there were nowhere else to seat them, Stepan Arkadyevich placed Levine and Kitty next to each other. "Well, why don't you sit here?" he said to Levine. The dinner was as good as the dinnerware, of which Stepan Arkadyevich was a great fancier. The soup Marie-Louise succeeded splendidly. The piroshki, which melted in the mouth, were irreproachable. The two servants and Matvey in white ties went about their duties with the food and wine, quite unobtrusively, quietly, and efficiently. On the material side, the dinner was a success. It was no less of a success on the non-material side. The conversation, now general, now particular, never lapsed, and became so lively by the end of dinner that the men got up from the table still talking, and even Alexey Alexandrovitch grew animated. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.